Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to keep thinking about the laws, but we're going to actually turn our attention to modern times. Because one of the biggest debates or with differences of opinion, this isn't a fighting debate, by the way, so no fists today. But it is a really key issue on how you approach really the Old Testament, or actually all of the scriptures, is what are we as modern Christians supposed to do with these laws? I mean, are they our laws? Are they just Israel's? Is there a in-between on that? Okay, there are many different options. So what I want you to do is real quick, let's do some discussion. So Monday morning, let's wake up by having a little small group discussion. So break up with some people around you and answer this question. In other words, what do we actually do? Or what should we do with the laws in the book of Moses as Christians? This is talking about as modern Christians. So go for it, and then we'll discuss it together and jump in. So again, there's probably various answers in here, and that's fine. As we go through, I'll try to connect your answers to different views. So would anybody like to share what your group So it sounds like there's two views that are espoused by this class. The first view is basically 10 Commandments are the summation of the law, and they're the universal aspect of it. Okay? The second view is also here when you start adding other laws that are in various places, there's a second approach to the laws that says that there's moral, they divide them into moral, civil, and ceremonial. Has anybody ever heard this before in your churches? So moral laws are laws that basically have universal application. Civil laws are laws that deal with like punishment for crimes, things like that. And then ceremonial would be laws related to like tabernacle priests, like what we talked about the other day. Okay, those are two big views. The second one, the moral, ceremonial, and civil, oftentimes seems like picking and choosing. But you guys got to agree with that? Like I would say to some believers who don't know that system, basically the way they determine which laws we're under is by going to the New Testament, and if it lines up, that's the law. Does that make sense? And then the third view is some people would argue that we're not under the Old Covenant laws at all, but they wouldn't negate that that we can't learn about God and that we can't have wisdom from them. It's just they're not our law code as Christians, including the 10 Commandments on that as well. So let's talk about, I'm going to give you my view, and then we will, but I want to go big picture today, and then we'll be done, okay? So obviously you're getting my view because I'm the teacher, but I appreciate you guys sharing. So let's roll. So here's the thing. When it comes to these laws, the most important principle we should follow is the most important principle we should always follow whenever we're interpreting any passage of the Bible. And what is that? You have to pay attention to the context. Context is king. Context is king. So let me illustrate this for you. A couple weeks ago, you guys read Noah and the Noah story with the flood. Okay, in chapter basically 6 and 7, Noah's getting instructions for building the ark. Were any of you tempted as you read those instructions to go out and build an ark? I know that sounds... No, why not? The point is this. When we read the Noah story and we read those detailed instructions for the ark, we realize that God's speaking to Noah, not me as the reader. Does that follow? Y'all following me? So it's really easy because the Noah story is so compact. What happens with the laws is the laws are over there's probably over 80 chapters of laws in the book of Moses. And so it's really easy to get in the weeds and forget the big picture. Does that make sense? And so what I want to do is us today just kind of zoom out and look at big picture and see how the context of the book of Moses, remember that chart I put up on Friday, helps us better understand these laws. Okay? So the first thing I want to do is I want us to talk about the context on either side of the laws. We might call this the before and after snapshots. So do I have any marketing majors? Okay, at least none of you want to admit it. Okay, marketing. In marketing, you guys know how before and after is like a huge deal. Before and after pictures. So like if you think about it, like I remember, I don't see them as much anymore. It might be because I don't watch as much TV anymore. But when I was younger, I always remember the car commercials, like the before and afters for like wax products for your cars. And it would be like this old, like beat up Rusty's. You remember Rusty's on Lightning McQueen? Kind of like that Rusty car, like Tow Mater kind of Rusty, right? And then they would use the stuff, and all of a sudden it would come out looking like a brand new Ferrari, and you're like, whoa, that before and after gets you. They're also very common with an area that I need to work on, like a hair loss for men. You get a before and after of a guy that's like bald, and the next thing you know, he looks like Fabio. And then they also, weight loss is big. You guys know, right? Before and after. So let's look at this before and after, and here's the question. We're going to see how well Moses did at selling the laws. So keep that file in your mind. We'll talk about it. So here we go. First before and after picture I want to give you is Israel, before and after Sinai. So here we go. So this is Israel on their way to Sinai. By the way, don't try to write this. You don't have to write all this. This is before Sinai, and this is when they're going from Mount Sinai to the land. So just kind of study this for a second and tell me what you notice. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's it. So they got worse, okay? So to be fair, they spent a lot more time on that side of Sinai than they did on this side. However, notice on this side, remember we talked about this the other day, that Israel's time in the wilderness was characterized by complaining and grumbling. And we see that. Complaining over there, we see a bunch of complaining as well. However, if you notice on that side of the mountain, not only do they have more rebellions, more sin, but their sin is much more rebellious and we might say high-handed. So you don't have to know all of these, but I do want you to know one. Okay, you see right here, this one, rebellion in Numbers 13 and 14. This is a familiar story, but some of you might not remember the reference. So let me give you the hint, and you guys, somebody tell me. This is the spy story. You need to know this story. This is Israel's rebellion in a place I wrote over here called Kadesh Barnea. This is monster because, if you remember, God brought Israel out of Egypt so that he could give them the promised land. In Numbers 13 and 14, they get to the edge of the promised land, and God says, go get it. And they dig their heels in because they're afraid of the spies' report, and they say no. Now that's big rebellion, okay? So here's the takeaway. We can see, first of all, here that they get worse and that there's more rebellion on the other side of Sinai. But when you consider that the purpose of the laws was to make them a what kind of nation? A holy nation, this is telling. Because what we're seeing is not only are they not holy, they're actually probably worse after they leave Mount Sinai. So here's what the takeaway on this before and after is. It is that the law, or the laws, increased Israel's sin. And just so you guys don't think I'm making this up, I'm going to reference you to one of my good friends, the Apostle Paul. He's not my good friend, but the Apostle Paul in Romans 5:20. And here's what he says. He says, moreover the law, and by the law he's talking about the Sinai covenant, entered that the offense might what? Abound. So what Paul's saying is that when God gave these laws, gave this covenant, that the offense, the sin actually abounded. And then in Romans, of course, he's getting to the good news. So he says, but where sin abounded, what? Grace abounded all the more. But his point is that the law increased sin. Any questions on that? So it's kind of like driving your car into a car wash, and then on the backside you come out and it's dirty, more dirty. And you're like, something's not working here. Okay. Second, before and after. We're going to look at God's actions. So Israel, we've seen their actions. Now let's look at what God does. So here's the second set. This one jumps off even a little more, doesn't it? So what would you say, what's our takeaway here? Yeah, so like on going to Mount Sinai, this is the one we, again, talked about the day. They complained about food and water. And really the only punishment was with the manna. They had, some of them disobeyed God and kept some manna. And so he sent, basically it spoiled, sent worms in it. But then when they leave Sinai, it's almost like any time somebody even thinks about opening their mouth to complain, somebody's dying. And God gets really creative, by the way, in the way he kills people in the book of Numbers. I'm not trying to be like sadistic, but it's pretty creative. I mean, so look at all this creativity. He sends fire. He strikes Miriam with leprosy. I'm going to come back to the generation dead. The coolest one is when the ground like just opens up and swallows people. These people have been dead so long it's not disrespectful, okay? Plague, Moses does not get to go in the land. There's venomous serpents, and he sends another plague. So it's like bad. And the one I want you guys to pay attention to again is this one, the generation dead. So when they refused to enter the land at Kadesh Barnea, the punishment was, as God said, that entire generation would die in the wilderness, which is why they had to wander around the wilderness for how long? 40 years. So that's why that side of the screen, by the way, is so much longer than this first side. They were actually only 11 days from the land, but they ended up being in the wilderness for 40 years because of their rebellion at Kadesh Barnea. Okay? So, here's the summary. 2 points. First, before we summarize it, note, this might look harsh, right? It might look like God's being harsh on the backside of Mount Sinai. But what we need to remember is that Israel, on 2 occasions, actually agreed to the terms of the covenant that God gave them. In other words, they accepted the deal. They shook hands. They signed the covenant, however you want to put it. And so when I look at this, it kind of reminds me of when you're a parent of young kids. So when you're a parent of young kids, one of the hardest decisions to make or things you have to discern is as far as when disciplining your kids, when what they did was whether it was in ignorance or in rebellion. Because let's just be honest, young kids oftentimes do foolish things. And when they do foolish things just because they're a young kid, that is much different than when you've told them 4 times not to do something and they still decide to do it. Do y'all see the difference? One is ignorance. The other is outright rebellion or against you. And so here's the difference. Here, we might say this was Israel's period of ignorance. But when they come to Mount Sinai and they clearly hear God and they clearly agree to the terms of the punishment, after that makes all of this pure what? Rebellion. And so therefore, God's punishment is just because they are rebelling against him. Okay? So here it is. Here's the takeaway from this screen. Paul says that the law, that is the Sinai covenant, actually increases wrath. In Romans 4:15, Paul says, "For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, there is no transgression." Okay? Let me just comment, it's not essential to the discussion, but that second part, where there is no law, there is no transgression, that's not saying there is no sin. A transgression is when somebody violates a specific command. Sin is much broader than that. Okay? All right, any question on that? So we've seen, if you look at the before and after snapshots, did Moses do a good job of selling the law? No, he did not. Moses would not have got any bonus from the Sinai tourism industry because he did not sell it. He actually kind of gives us a what assessment of the law. He kind of gives us a negative. And we're going to talk about that tension in just a second, okay? All right, so here's the other thing I want to look at. When it comes to context, as you're reading through the laws, what you begin to notice is there's stories that are embedded in the laws at many points throughout the narrative. And when you read these stories, many of them, you begin to see kind of a pattern within these stories and the laws. So again, let's talk about sports one more time. Sorry, I keep doing sports illustrations. But if you've ever been on a sports team before and you're like playing another team, what do your coaches do like the week or the days before you play the other team? Yeah, they watch film. Why do they watch film? Yeah, oftentimes when you're watching game film of your opponent, you're trying to pick up patterns, right? So in other words, you'll see like if you're in a sport, if there's a certain offensive formation they have, you know that they run certain plays out of that formation. Does that make sense? So you can oftentimes watch, if you're watching a film, you can pattern it so that you have kind of maybe a jump start when they line up in a certain formation, you know, okay, they're only doing like 3 or 4 things from this. Well, when we look at these kind of stories within the laws, we see some patterns. And so I want us to look at the stories, and 2 of the stories as an example, and then look at the patterns associated with them. So I'm calling these the rebellions at Sinai. And the first rebellion at Sinai is a mega rebellion. And this is the story of the golden calf, which you guys read this last week, correct? Okay. So hopefully this is still fresh. been 4 days since your quiz, 3 days, so hopefully it's fresh on your mind. But the golden calf occurs when Moses is up on the mountain getting what? He's getting the tablets of stone on which God wrote the 10 Commandments. While he's up there, the people get impatient, and basically they build a golden calf. Now, when we hear that story, what do we honestly think about Israel at this point?
They're idiots.
Okay, yes, we think they're idiots. And the reason we think that is because we're thinking from our secular Western context. If we go back to Israel's context, it's not as stupid as it seems. Because here's why. We oftentimes think that Israel's sitting there. They take some wood, carve a calf, melt their gold down, plaster it over the calf, and say, here's your God who brought you out of Egypt. And we think they actually think that wooden golden calf brought them out of Egypt. But that's not how they would have thought. What the ancient world did, and this is all around Egypt, all around Israel, is the ancient world regularly made images of their gods. And they believed that the gods either indwelt in the image or actually rode on top of the image or stood on the image. Is this making sense? So the golden calf is not Israel initially breaking the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. They're actually breaking the second commandment, which says you shall not make a what? An image. So Israel was making an image that they were using to represent Yahweh. Or some scholars believe they actually believe that Yahweh stood on the back of the bull. It would have been a bull calf, by the way. Just like God is kind of, remember on the Ark of the Covenant, God's presence was said to be on the Ark of the Covenant. Does that make sense? And this is where we get into our pattern. So again, big picture, let's think patterns. They had just heard in Exodus 20, God speak the 10 Commandments from out of the fire. While Moses is on the mountain, he's actually getting the tabernacle instructions, which have to do with what? How to properly worship Yahweh. So they have the second commandment. They've already heard it. And the irony is that the placement is right after the tabernacle instructions. So here's the pattern. What it shows us is that almost as soon as the words leave God's mouth, what are the people doing? They're rebelling against them. So that's our pattern. They get something new, and they rebel against it, okay? Now, here's the deal. You guys remember from reading, what does God want to do with Israel when he sends Moses down? He says, I'm going to destroy them, and I'm going to start over with you, Moses. And then Moses does what prophets were supposed to do. He intercedes to God on behalf of the people, and God relents of his punishment, of the wrath he was about to pour out on all the people. And then Moses asked to see Yahweh's glory. And you guys remember this story from reading? God passed by him on the mountain, and God makes probably one of the most important revelations in the Old Testament in these two verses, Exodus 34, 6 through 7. So he passes by Moses, and he says, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilt, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. Now this verse presents what we might call a balanced picture of God. It emphasizes, again, keep in mind, this is the context of the golden calf, and it emphasizes his grace, his mercy, and his forgiveness. But then at the end, it also emphasizes his justice. But if you had to put the two on a scale, which one's tipping the scale a lot more? Let me help you. Third and fourth generation, 1,000. Which one's higher? 1,000. What's tipping the scale is it's way more of an emphasis in his love and mercy, forgiveness and grace than it is on the justice in this. Again, because it's showing how gracious he was to Israel in the golden calf, not to destroy them. All right, even though they broke the covenant. How do we know they broke the covenant? What does Moses do with the tablets when he gets to the bottom? He smashes them as a symbol of their breaking of the covenant. Okay? Now, if you're going to memorize a passage of Scripture in the Old Testament, I would highly recommend these verses. Because once you memorize these verses, you'll start seeing them everywhere in the Old Testament, especially like in the book of Psalms And then there's also one passage that you probably know, but you don't realize that they quoted this verse. And I know you guys know this story because you probably have watched VeggieTales before. Do y'all remember Jonah? Everybody stops at Jonah at chapter 3 when Nineveh repents. But chapter 4 is a really important chapter because Jonah goes out of the city, and what does he do? He actually says he wished he was dead. Like he says, I wish I were dead. Tells God that. And in his pity party, he tells God why he fled in the first place. And guess which verse he quotes? Right here. He quotes this. He says, I know that you're a gracious and merciful God. And he knew that he knew that God would forgive the Ninevites. And he hated the Ninevites so much he didn't want God to forgive them. So you can see how Jonah's story is not about Jonah didn't know about God. In fact, Jonah knew God so well that he didn't want to go to Nineveh because he didn't want his enemies forgiven. Okay, so this is a really important passage for the rest of Scripture. All right, rebellion number 1, golden calf. The second one is less familiar, but it's really important. This is in Leviticus chapter 10, and this is called the profane fire of Nadab and Abihu. Nadab and Abihu were 2 sons of Aaron, and scholars debate on what they did exactly wrong. But basically what happened is they took some form of incense into the holy place, and it was not authorized. They either did it incorrectly, they did it at the wrong time, whatever. Many people believe they might have been drunk when it happened. But the point is that when they did that as God's priest, does anybody know what happened? What happened? How God punished them? He sent fire. A big fireball came out of the altar and it consumed them. They were toast. Okay. So why is this important? Here's why this is important. Chapters 8 and 9 of Leviticus are when Moses consecrates or dedicates Aaron and his sons to the priestly service. Do you see this? So they're dedicated. Aaron offers a sacrifice. God sends fire down from heaven and consumes it. And then the next story is this story where they fell.
Are they his sons?
Those are his 2 sons, yep. So this also comes after instructions on sacrifices in Leviticus 1 through 7. You see where this is going again. Just like the golden calf, what we see here is as soon as God starts the priestly ministry, what do we get? Fail. We see them failing. So this is our pattern kind of through it. You get God begins something new, a new work, and Israel fails. God begins a new work, Israel fails. So let's kind of wrap this up. Big picture, is Moses giving us a negative or a positive assessment of these laws that at Mount Sinai, this covenant at Mount Sinai? It's negative, but there's a little tension there. Why is there a tension? So the law, here's what we want to say. Listen, the laws themselves are not negative. Are everybody following this? Remember, the laws are positive. They're supposed to make Israel holy. But what we see in the story is that because of Israel's rebellious hearts, the laws are actually harming them. They're hurting them. And that's where we have to keep reading the story to figure out the solution to that. So let's summarize, because this is kind of complicated. We've already said all 3 points. Let's say them again. First, God's intent for these laws at Sinai was to set Israel apart as holy. This is what we talked about on Friday. Second, the laws actually increased Israel's sin and God's wrath towards them. Now let's pause right here. Let's see if you guys remember a few weeks ago. When God is pouring his wrath out, who are the only people that are spared? The righteous. So the fact that Israel's getting blasted with God's wrath shows they are not righteous. So they need righteousness. But it's pretty clear they're not going to get it through what? Through these laws. Does everybody see where this is going? So then the third point is if, as we read Numbers, in all seriousness, when you read Numbers, you begin to think, man, if something doesn't change, these people are goners. Because it's just like one story after another of them experiencing God's wrath. So what it does is it points us forward in the story to say, God has to do something. God has to intervene if these people are going to survive. So they highlight the need for a future work of God. And we're going to talk about that on Wednesday when we come into Deuteronomy. I'm not done. I'm just telling you. That's what we're going to talk about on Wednesday. They highlight the need for a future work of God. So let's circle back to our first question. Here's the point that I'm trying to make, is that when we read these laws, Moses doesn't just tell us that God gave the laws to Israel. He shows us what the laws did or didn't do. And here's the point. As we look back at these laws, we realize they were given to Israel in their cultural context. But as we look back, we realize that the thing people need is righteousness, and the righteousness doesn't come through these laws. This doesn't mean the laws are not good. It's just they're not sufficient to produce righteousness. And that's where we're going to get to the future work of God. So as modern-day Christians, we don't have to try to go back and pick and choose and try to figure out which ones we're under. We need to recognize that the laws as a whole point us forward in the biblical story. And when we get to the New Testament, we're going to find out the answer on Wednesday, but the answer is fulfilled in the New Testament. And that's where, as Christians, though, we can look back on these laws and learn about God's character, about God's desire for justice, about God's desire for holiness. We can learn from them. We can grow His wisdom, but here's the deal. We don't go back and read them as if they're our law code. Does that make sense on that? So let me wrap up by giving you two movie illustrations to kind of help understand this. The first one is very divisive, and I'm very sorry. And it's very divisive among the ladies. Dear John. But some ladies hate this movie. I think it's because of the ending. But anyway, okay, so here we go. I'm going to do my best. Please forgive me. I watched it once like 20 years ago and haven't seen it since. All right. But basically, John's a soldier, falls in love with this girl. What's her name? Anybody know her name? Okay, the girl. He goes off to war, and they write letters back and forth. Hence why it's called Dear John. Then apparently while he's off at war, somebody else moves in and makes some moves. And anyway, it's a weird story on the end. But the whole point of it is this, is that the reason it's called Dear John is because she's writing letters to John the whole movie, and he's writing back to her. But you can't see this, but on the Blu-ray box here, it has a question for the viewer of the movie. It says this: what would you do with a letter that changed everything? So in other words, as you watch this movie, it wants you to ask, what would you do with a letter that changed everything? Notice that it doesn't say, what would you do if you received a letter from John? Does this make sense? Because we know John is a character in the movie. He's not going to write a letter to you as the viewer. So it's saying, put yourself in that situation. What would you do with a letter that changed everything? So how does this relate to the laws? So here we have a bunch of laws that God gave to Israel. And I would argue the question for us as Christians isn't to go back and try to say which one should we live under as a law code, but we should ask ourselves, what would I do if God had given me those laws? And you know what the answer is? What's the answer? What would you and I have done if we had received the laws like Israel? The same thing Israel did. Because Israel is a mirror for humanity. Y'all see this? So that's the point of the story, is we all have the same heart problem that Israel had, and we all therefore need the same solution that Israel would receive. So when we read the laws, that is one way it helps us. All right, second movie, I got to hurry. This is it. The Magnificent Seven. The 1963 or 67 version, not the new one. They ruined the movie. Okay, sorry, this is one of my top 3 favorite movies. All right, Magnificent Seven. Here's a quick summary. There's this Mexican village that's getting raided by this bandit. So the village sends up to Texas to hire some gunslingers to come down and protect them. While the gunslingers are there, they train the farmers in the village, and they basically defend themselves. And at the end of the movie, they run the bandits off. A couple of the gunslingers die, but the village is saved. Okay, here's what I want to focus on. When you think about like Westerns, and in particular Westerns about gunslingers, what's kind of a big takeaway about gunslinging?
Live by the sword, die by the sword.
Okay, that is a takeaway, but it's like gunslingers are cool, right? I mean, would you not say that? Like, if you want to be cool, you go be a gunslinger. It's what every little boy does, right, with his pistols. Okay, but here's the deal. In the middle of this movie, something interesting starts to happen. As they're living in the village, The two main gunslingers start having this conversation about how as they lived among the villagers, the farmers, they began to doubt their current lifestyle choice, and they started talking about whether they should settle down, marry, and have kids and start a farm. You're like, oh, that's odd. The next scene goes, and there's this one gunfighter who had 3 of the little village kids who just followed him around everywhere. They adored him. And as he's packing up, because they got kicked out of the village, one of the little kids said something about their fathers being a coward. So the cowboy grabs him, puts him on his knee, and just wears him out, stands him back up, and says, don't you ever call your dads a coward. And he basically goes on to say how he's the coward, not their dads, because their dads carry a weight of responsibility all the time to care for their wives and their children and to farm the land. So you're like, man, what's going on? Fast forward. The last scene of the movie, they're riding out of town, the 2 main cowboys, and there was one little wannabe cowboy who followed them there. Well, while he followed them there, he fell in love with one of the village girls. So he rides to the edge of town, looks at them 2 and says, adios. And he turns back and goes in to marry this girl. And the 2 main cowboys look at each other and say, well, it looks like the farmers won. So here's the point. The whole movie is about gunslinging, how they saved this village, right? And yet, at the end of the movie, the message isn't be a gunslinger. The message is be a farmer. Do y'all see that? How it took the whole message and flipped it on its head? So how does that apply to the book of Moses? Just like this movie was full of gunslinging, but the ultimate message wasn't be a gunslinger, the book of Moses is full of laws. But the ultimate message isn't the laws are where you're going to find your salvation or your peace or your good life. That's found elsewhere. You have to keep reading in the Bible to find that. So it's the same idea. It takes it and it critiques it and it turns it on its head.